let's have a look at, what botnets are in there, what type of things are in there, what type of degree of maliciousness do we expect, because we know that they're potentially going to hit, a system here based on this evidence or this data. And it all comes down to, should we be offensive? Should we be protecting, or should we be turning around and pushing back and being offensive?
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Joining me today is Kylie Watson, Australian-New Zealand lead client partner, national security from IBM. So Kylie, it's wonderful to have you here today. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts, your opinions. You've got a great background, so I'd love to start there. Tell me a little bit more about you and where you started and where are you now?
Thanks, Carissa. Great to be here. Well, I actually have an interesting background in terms of it's not a linear progression. So I started in military engineering and was really fascinated at the time of what we were doing in the space of explosives ordnance and bridges and roads and various things that you use, and it helps on the warfare front, right, in terms of disruptions, in terms of access to deployed environments. I started getting really interested in the human side of it. So I went and studied a sociology degree and started finding out more about how people think, how groups behave, why we do the things we do, and really getting into what we call the psychological operations side of military warfare. So we might look like we're putting a bridge over here, but actually we're not going to access that area. We're actually going to access over somewhere else, right? So it's really just I suppose, a mechanism or a strategy to convince the enemy, per se, that, we're doing X over here, but actually we're really doing Y. And really got into it. And so I left the military and went to engineering consulting and really got interested in why we're putting roads in where we're putting them, how we're putting in churches and schools and town planning and wayfinding in hospitals, like very different, right, to where I am today. And on that journey, I did a bit of a change into IT. I don't really know why I did, except perhaps my husband was in IT and he looked like he was really enjoying it. And I was, a bit of we're going through what we call, the great reflection. I was having a reflection back then. It was the global financial crisis. So I might be showing my age a bit here. But starting to think about, what do I really want to do? What really excites me? And although I was interested in the engineering side of it, I thought I'm actually really interested in that cybersecurity, data security risk. And it was all sort of becoming a thing in technology back then. So I switched over and started to focus on data risk, and then lent into cybersecurity risk, because every time there was data risks, data breaches, data issues, they nearly always went to the heart of being security. And I went back to uni and I studied data and cybersecurity risk, and then started running teams of cybersecurity experts. And of course, with my military background, it made sense that I would take those learnings, particularly in a skill shortage, back into that national security space. So probably long-winded, potted, history there, but interesting from engineering over to IT, national security, at the beginning, and then rounded off and back to national security again.
Wow, I love that. I don't think that was that long-winded at all, to be fair. I think that was very short. And I ask this because I think it's really lending itself to my next question. You've got a great background, very diverse, and the question I want to know from you is, why do people get into cybercrime? Now, you've got that strong sociology background, and so I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, especially being in IT, cyber, the military, national security. What's the motivation for cybercrime? And you've mentioned to me in the past, it's similar to how people fall into street gangs. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two key areas we have to look at with two main themes of actors. So we've got the nation state actors, and then we've obviously got the organised criminal gangs. And there's slightly different motivations for each of those groups. So we go to the exciting one, the cyber organised criminal gangs. When you think about it, a lot of the people that ended up in these spaces in organised crime, they tend to, and the research shows, they tend to be looking at thrill seeking, rebellion. They tend to have a sense of injustice, a lot of the time struggling for acceptance, and they're really looking for a sense of belonging. How do I actually belong? And that's not too different to a lot of the research that was done on street gangs, particularly those back in the 90s in New York, and when there was significant issues there about what they were actually looking for. And it was a sense of belonging. And where that came from is a theory that we call enemy theory. So, enemy theory is essentially describing people who are drawn to crime. People who are drawn to crime, quite often under this theory, have tried legitimate ways to get ahead. They've tried to learn at school, and perhaps they've had learning disorders, or they've had difficult family lives that haven't supported that, or socioeconomic constraints. Whatever it is, they've tried to get ahead. They've tried to get a job, and a good paying job, and they've been bullied, or something's happened, or maybe the people they've associated with have undermined that. And so it shows that people intrinsically do try to do the right thing, apart from, I guess, less than 1% that are sociopaths. But the majority of us do try to do the right thing. And so enemy theory shows that these people try to do the right thing again and again, and they keep getting undermined, and they just can't catch a break. They just can't get ahead. And if anyone watches or has ever watched the TV show Shameless, you'll get it. Because there's a whole bunch of characters in a family there from a significantly disadvantaged background, and they keep trying to get ahead. And every time they do, you see something happens, and they just come straight back down again to where they were. And it's all wrapped up into what we also call social learning theory. And I don't want to throw lots of theory, so I promise it's the last bit of theory I'll throw at you, where individuals develop motivations and skills to commit crimes through the exposure to others involved in crime. So if you associate with deviant peers, you're going to end up like that. And when I was a kid, it was horrible when you think about it now, but my dad used to say, if you lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. And that sort of jumps into my head when I think of this, because I think, well, of course, and so all of these things are drawn together, and they get a sense of acceptance in this world. And it goes to the, I suppose what we call the virtual environment, because it's less tangible. You feel less likely to get caught. The law is very murky. It's not like robbery and murder, where it's tangible fines, you do it physically. It's a bit harder to cover up than it is in the cyber world. And so they feel, it's almost like they don't kind of think they're going to get caught. And so it becomes more attractive for them. And, those that are particularly susceptible are those who have what we call internet addiction disorder. I do worry that my youngest son, I think a lot of us worry about our kids like this, spend a lot of time on the internet. But internet addiction disorder is similar to alcoholism, right? It's a real social dilemma. And what it means is people are getting this socialization, this sense of belonging. They develop a persona. Even, and I have to admit, I play Pokemon. I have a persona on Pokemon, and it is absolutely not like me, right? So you could be somebody different on the internet, and that makes it feel like it's a bit less tangible that you might get caught. And you can become popular online. And we see these movie stereotypes of, maybe the person who's a bit physically challenged, doesn't do any exercise, sitting on a couch, eating chips, playing gaming, and interacting with other people online. And it's a bit of a stereotype, but you can also see and realize that actually that is a thing. They do get a sense of belonging. They do become addicted, and they do learn from each other because there's chat rooms, and they can be someone that they're perhaps not normally when they present. And normally is always an interesting word in sociology, but this becomes a normalized, the persona becomes a normalized part of who they are. And so they really don't think that what they're doing is wrong in a lot of these cases. It's almost like a job, or it's almost like everyone else is doing it, and I'm less likely to get caught. So the motivations and skills are very much about that sense of belonging in a group.
Wow, that's awesome. There's so much going on there when you're talking. Okay, so my stepfather is a criminal judge, and he obviously puts people in prison. And one day I asked him, hey, If these people or children had a better upbringing, do you think that they would have committed the crime? And he said no. And so my question to you, Kylie, would be, do you think a lot of these people are sort of just born into it? Like maybe if I don't know, maybe their parents are criminals and then they're a criminal, or like you said before, lay down with dog, get up with fleas. There's always that analogy we like to use around you are the top 5 people you hang around. So if your friends are criminals, there's a high probability you're going to be one. Is there a bit of that in there from what you're saying?
A little bit, like in terms of there are ways and means to be able to try to get out of that. Not everybody, in enemy theory, there are some that actually get a leg up, and it's usually when a teacher might lean in when they're younger and actually care about them and show them a different pathway and really support and sponsor and mentor them. Or perhaps there was someone that was in the juvenile system where somebody actually, a social worker, whoever it is, took the time and the effort to show them a different pathway, or perhaps a mentor or somebody, because it's not as easy as correlating it to something like, oh, well, you're born into it, because it is the environment around you, but there are ways and means to be able to step out of it. It's just that it's difficult for them. And it's not that everyone is has this disadvantaged background, by the way. And there are also political motivations. You may be born into a family that's very political, and you've decided that you're going to take that to the next level, right? So again, the people around you might be quite political, but you don't have quite a sense of belonging. You don't quite fit, perhaps, with what they're doing, and you are, remember, the thrill seeking, the rebellion, the sense of injustice. So it really depends on the actual personality and the wiring of the person as well. And we're just talking here about the organized crime, right? There's a whole different set of motivations for the nation states.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I guess, look, we're not blanketing everyone with the same brush. It's just more talking like theoretically about things. You made a good statement before is if people are undermined, then is it then that they resort to crime? So you're saying like they get pushed down, pushed back constantly, and then it's sort of um, this vicious cycle. And then is it sort of after, I don't know, 1,000 times something's gone wrong, that a lot of these people are then resulting to the crime?
No, I think it's more like the street gang theory, right? And we see, these potentially, it doesn't have to be younger, but you see these younger people who are looking for that belonging, and they're looking to, with the online, it's so much easier to be someone you're not. It's so much easier to be cool. You have a different persona to what you might actually be. You could be a different gender. You could portray yourself to be in a different country and just, hide and root, where you're actually from, and in terms of your digital footprint. So I think it's a whole number of factors. There's the social learning theory, anime theory, internet addiction disorder, and it just happens to be the right culmination of those things for that personality, for that person to go, you know what, I think, and they encourage each other, the chat rooms in particular, who's leading the chat room, and who's actually the leader? Do I aspire to be like them as well? So it's just all these individual senses of connections.
Talk to me a little bit more about internet addiction disorder.
Yes. So internet addiction disorder, like I'd said, it's similar to alcoholism. And if you've watched The Social Dilemma, a lot of this, yeah, is wired for you to spend more time on it, right? And so you wrap everything up in it, and it's really difficult to get away from the internet. So the more people are on the internet, the more likely they are to lose their human social connections face to face. And if you look at COVID, I haven't seen stats on it. And when I talk about we need more research, I'd love to go and have a look if there's been any research on this. But I would imagine that there was a lot more time spent online. And therefore, there's a lot more exposure potentially to being recruited into some of these cyber criminal gangs, or yeah, because you're just spending more time online and you're just exposed more to this kind of potential to be approached, or potential to meet people that are giving you a sense of belonging and may have malicious intent that you don't know about yet.
Yeah, I think I've sort of read in the past, even people that get into like terrorism stuff, that's how they're like, oh, they gave me a sense of belonging and then I fell into it type of thing, like without them knowing, like it wasn't like a conscious decision. And then all of a sudden they're amongst it from what I've heard. The other thing as well, earlier this year, Wall Street Journal brought out this limited like podcast. It was called Hack Me If You Can. The short version of it was a guy that basically something happened in his car, I think, and he couldn't pay it off, or there was some issue. And so his friend said, "I'll just get into like doing like cybercrime stuff." And then he said very quickly he paid off the debt to this car. But then he goes, "But then I just stayed in it and I couldn't give it up because it was just too easy money." And I found that really interesting that he just stayed in it because he's like, "Wow, I don't have to leave my house. I don't even have to work that much." And he was saying he was making so much money a day that would be like more than he could potentially make in a month with his skill set, like if he were to go back into the workforce.
It's so true. I know I had a conversation with my husband a while ago, and we were joking that, I'm exposed to this every day. And we're looking at the Colonial Pipeline at the time of the attack over in the US on the eastern seaboard, that obviously had fuel pressures and resulting in, people fighting at the pumps and things, and looking at, the social impacts of that. And they walked away, I think it was with about $5 million. And I was talking to my husband, and he goes, "We're in the wrong business." Like, seriously, they weren't a major organized criminal gang. That was, quite a small group of individuals that, morphed together and decided to do this. It wasn't a highly sophisticated nation state or organized crime type of attack. And of course, we're never going to do it. But I can see why, because, and you go back to anime theory, might be in a job, you're trying to get ahead, you haven't got a promotion, you're trying to do the right thing, and then the wrong thing just seems easier, and it's a bit cool and gives you a bit of belonging, and is going to help you with your finances. Then you can understand, people may be predisposed to those theories, and those backgrounds may be more likely to do that and to go, okay. And like I said earlier, it feels less tangible. You feel like you're less likely to get caught because you're not, when you go and hold someone up, right? The service station, it's a physical person there with a gun or a knife or whatever, threatening and saying some words, right? That's tangible. It's physical. There's evidence there. But a lot of that goes away when you look at online crime.
Absolutely. And I was interviewing a guy in the UK. So he's the global cybersecurity advisor for ESET, and he worked in the police force for 14 years, I believe, or 18 years. And he was saying that it's 1% of people that they catch when it comes to cybercrime. He goes, and even if we do, Carissa, he goes, they get limited jail time. It's really hard to prove, or they've done another country, and then there may be no treaties involved, or that's it. They don't have to be extradited to the UK. So there's so many like loopholes, which makes it inherently easier. And the question that I asked him was like, I'm not a criminal, but if I were to be a criminal, it'd be a lot easier to commit cybercrime, right? But if you go out and you murder someone, the penalties are a lot harsher, right? So it's like,
Yeah. And you see the person's face, right? You see the fear. You don't see that. It's faceless. Yes.
absolutely. So then I guess all the things that you've mentioned today on the theories, the internet addiction disorder, as well as COVID, would you anticipate that obviously, yes, cybercrime's getting worse, but do you think what's happened with recent time, it's going to accelerate this? And like you said, it is faceless. We can't actually see from an empathetic point of view, like we're hurting people because we can't see them.
Yeah, it's definitely accelerating, and we can see, there's all these different statistics, but all of them agree that we are facing larger, more advanced, more persistent, automated threats than we've ever faced before. And we've obviously got the skill shortage. And then you look at, the responses. One of the things people often forget is that you're defending this, you're constantly surveilling it. And if you look at the human side of it, which, is obviously my expertise, it's that you're under pressure. You have decision fatigue all the time. And you just imagine you're just defending, defending, defending. But when you're an attacker, you could go have some lunch and then come back again, and start attacking, maybe just click the button and it automates and does the things you want it to. And so there's a lot less pressure on the attacker than there is on the responder. And so it means that, it is increasing, and it is easier to be an attacker than it is to be a defender or a responder.
So on that note, what would be some of your recommendations? Like it is going to get worse. I mean, it's not an easy answer, and I know that, but I'm just curious to hear from your point of view with your background and things that you're seeing in your role. What can sort of people start to take away from this, especially if they do have children, stuff like that, and they're like, oh my gosh, like this potentially may be something that they never thought that their child may fall into? Like, do you have any sort of advice?
Yeah, I do think we need to do more research on the motivations and behaviors and go even deeper. A lot of the cyber security criminal behavioral research has only been done in the last few years. And prior to that, a lot of it was more just on general criminal behavior. So not cyber related specifically. And I know there's a study, a really cool study that's being done at the moment on, can you work out the degree of maliciousness of the attack based on the different patterns, based on the different technologies used, the networks, the servers, what cloud bases, databases exfiltrated, that type of thing. But I think you've got to go a step back and go, we've got all these interventions for crime, and there's still crime. Crime still exists. It's always going to exist to some form or extent in society. It's just how we are. It's been like that since, man and I shouldn't say mankind, should I? What do we say now? Since time began, right? Since people have been on the planet. And so we do need more research on it, though, to help reduce it, because when we do the more research and put the more time and effort and have the interventions, like I mentioned earlier, the social workers and teachers and other people out there in the community, then we will be more effective in getting people to understand, hey, this is not okay. And I really worry about things like, we may have seen in the news. There was recently some young boys at a boys' school, and I won't mention the school, but who, were saying some pretty horrific and horrible things that you shouldn't really be saying at all, and you shouldn't be putting in writing. And then you see some of the other behaviours and things that are occurring around you. And, I've overheard some nasty voicemails and things that, teen girls send each other. And I think, is this where it's starting now? They're getting away with this kind of behaviour and we don't stop it and we don't have an intervention. Will it get worse? So are we actually escalating by not having these interventions, particularly with younger people coming through?
Yeah, it's so true. I have been told from friends of mine what's happening to some of their children. I'm just like, gosh, it was never that vicious when I was at school, which, it was only probably about 13 years ago, so it wasn't that long ago, but they've definitely upped the ante in terms of the savageness. So, yeah, you're right. I think if we don't intervene, it could spiral out of control. But I'd like to switch gears now, and I'd like to talk to you about PSYOP. So, what is it specifically?
Yeah, so psyops is more in the nation state space, right? So what we call the information warfare space, and it's psychological operations. And there's actually a really good example with the Ukraine-Russia conflict that I can talk to on it. But essentially, psyops is, looking at how you disrupt, confuse with a credible threat, and it has to be credible and based in a little bit of fact, an enemy, or how you actually get them to, start thinking down the path that you want them to think. So you're essentially trying to start running the brains of your enemy rather than their commanders in traditional chain of command doing it. And so some really good examples in history have been, a lot of people don't realize this, but um, the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue in 2003 was actually from an army psyops team who had got a whole bunch of people rounded up and did that as an emotional reaction around the world to show that the regime had toppled. Right. So it wasn't, it was engineered. In 1944, I think it was. This is one of the earlier examples where in modern history, where the US recorded prisoners of war, and they reproduced the sound of lots and lots of tanks and lots of artillery fire sounding, and misled the German troops. So they had it broadcast, misled the German hierarchy and officers and troops to think that they had a greater presence than what they actually had. The one I love the most, and it's in ancient history, is Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan, he was a pretty nasty guy, but he had psyops nailed. And what he did, and this is very gross, but what he would do, he would go and lay siege to a city, and he would kill a whole bunch of people on the way through, right? And then he would get the dead bodies, he'd collect them, and they'd be a bit rotted and a bit yucky, and he would get his troops to throw them over the castle walls and actual bodies, right? So can you imagine you're in your castle area, you've got the enemy coming down on you, but on top of that, he would tie brushes to the tails of his horses. And he was in a particular dry, dusty area of the Mongol Empire desert, where dust would, be absolutely a thing. And so what would happen is he'd come down with his cavalry with these brushes tied to the tails of the horses, which would sweep up the dust. So the people behind the castle walls or, the fortified areas would just see these clouds of dust just coming at them. And they would do, the loud hooting, scary, horrible guttural noises and screaming as they came through and then fling dead bodies, over the walls. Would you run away? Would you surrender? Would you go, there's no hope? So the idea of the psyops and how that's being used in cybersecurity now is really recent. So with the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and this is in the news and in the media and quite well known. So I don't think I'm transgressing any national security boundaries in this one. But what they've done in the Ukrainian areas where they've actually captured is Russia has gained control of the internet. So they've rerouted the internet through Russian providers. And the internet that is now provided to the Ukrainians in these captured areas is monitored, right? It's restricted. It has censorship. The Ukrainian networks have been blocked. So they have to go through the Russian internet. Russia has been handing out free SIM cards and even to some extent some free phones. So these people really have no choice, but if they want to talk to family and friends, they want a connection, and we all crave connection, they have to use these Russian operated systems. And Starlink, and we hear about Elon Musk providing the free internet services to Ukraine. Starlink is having to focus on helping the military effort. I think, I could be wrong, I think it was only about 15,000 free user kits they were able to issue to the civilians from the Starlink, and the rest of it is being used by the Ukrainian military. So regardless of which side you're on in that conflict, just think about it, that it's all being rerouted, right? So they're not getting the information from the sources they previously had, and they have no choice in it. And so that's a classical psychological operations in the internet and everything. They're now having to, they're being disrupted. They're being confused. It's a credible threat. It's logical and factual. Everyone needs to be able to access their phones and have contact. And it's being subjected to disinformation and propaganda.
Wow. Wow, that's really interesting because I guess that's what leads me to my next point. And then from my understanding, from what you've said, is that there's just not enough being done then from a psyops perspective, I guess from a cyber war then perspective, just touching on the Ukraine Russia thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think more generally too. So if we look at, and what I hadn't covered is the motivation of those that join the nation states. And a lot of that is nationalism, right? So it's, if you join a cyber criminal gang, it's a sense of belonging, quite often dollars, you mentioned before, walking away with some money. It could sometimes be a bit of sense of injustice. But if you look at the nation states, it's very much about nationalism. It's usually a lot of ex-military involved in there. And there's a lot of psychological operations that go on. And in terms of research, we've just not done enough and don't have enough in the psychology or sociology space for this. It has not been a large focus. And we do have a cyber skills engineering shortage. We have general shortages across cybersecurity, but I have to say, in my own experience, it's very difficult to actually get the people who are hands-on tools as well. So we need to find a way to get those who are more interested in the humanities to start thinking about this. And those that say, particularly teenagers, and I have teenagers myself, so I encounter a lot of teenage discussions about what they're going to do with their lives. And they talk about, well, I'll do criminal psychology. And it's not usually in the curriculum to do cyber security criminal psychology. So I think we need to start, like in the universities at the moment, I've just finished writing some courses with some universities who are introducing cybersecurity courses. Perhaps we start with the universities and have it as some options to focus on cyber psychology. Because some of it is happening, but it's really only quite new, and we don't have the depth of research that we need. And how do we defend when we don't know the degree of maliciousness? We don't know all of the motivations. It's harder to defend.
So you make a couple of interesting points. One of which I think was recently, like last week, the Victorian government said that they're going to waive like nursing to study nursing. They're going to waive the fees. Do you think the government should do that for security? Now I know there's a few things like that is floating around in this space. I think in Wollongong, there's you can do your degree, but then you also sort of get like a quote unquote apprenticeship type of model, or you've got your standard scholarship stuff. But do you think maybe if the government opened that up, that would encourage people to study engineering, or it's not really going to make a difference from your perspective?
No, I think it would encourage it. I think I do a lot of, try to give back a lot. And I do a lot of interviews of young people who are looking to get their first jobs, outside of university. And I've had some really interesting experiences in doing that. And one of them has been very much saying to a very smart young man, I remember he had sort of 95% plus in everything, and he done a capture the flag with Amazon and was in the top five of the country, and was really super keen, and he wanted to go to a top university. And I felt a bit bad, but I had to sort of pull him down a bit because he was a little arrogant. And I said to him, do you realize that somebody could leave school, do some micro credentials in cybersecurity, learn to code? Perhaps they go to TAFE, perhaps they don't. But they might actually beat you if you're going for a job with, let's say, a big four company or a major technology company, because they have more hands on practical knowledge. And the universities, some of them, not all, but some of them are a bit behind in that. And he sort of looked at me with his mouth open because he'd been wired to think I'd be the best in everything, and I go to the top university, I get the top marks, I win everything, not actually understanding that, there are so many other programs out there, and the need at the moment is for practical hands-on tools right now. And so I think we have to think about how we make this really obvious. So there was only one female interviewed. There was a batch of 20 that I was helping. There was only one female in it. And she got to me and she said, actually, I didn't pick this, but all the other interviews were full and they stuck me with you. I was like, oh, okay, thanks.
Stuck her with you. Okay.
And I said, okay, well, do you want me to interview you, or do you want me to tell you about cybersecurity? She goes, yeah, tell me about cybersecurity. So I started telling her some of the stuff we were doing. And she was like, wow, that is so cool. I had no idea. So maybe it's just education, of these people. And I did run into her a few weeks ago. And I don't know if she was joking. I hope she wasn't, but she said, I'm absolutely wide. I've gone and had a look at all the universities and I'm going to study cybersecurity. I thought, well, great, because I've planted the idea in her head. But one of the things, and Carissa, I've noticed, and I was very impressed by, was one of the universities I was helping running and designing their program. We did a competitive search, on the other universities, and one of them did not require an ATAR at all for entry or a pathways program. And I thought that's actually really smart, because as long as they get in there and they can actually do the work, and you have it so that, the first subject is not one that they run away and go, this is too hard, then that's a good attractor, because after COVID, a lot of these young people are really struggling and not knowing what they want to do, and they're scared about their marks and, what am I going to do? And if you have a university entry with no ATAR, that's a big incentive, right? To go, I might apply for this course.
Well, then you're letting the barrier down. There's then more people for entry, perhaps. Maybe they didn't get great marks, but hey, maybe they'd make a brilliant cybersecurity engineer. So I'm curious to know, with the lady that you were sitting with, and she says, I had no idea that's what it was. What was her idea? Do you know?
Now, she thought it was a bunch of programmers that just sat there doing codey stuff, capture the flag kind of stuff. And she sort of thought, this is, from her words, it was sort of like a whole bunch of nerdy guys all getting together in a room. And, it is male dominated right now. There's a lot of industries that are though as well, and there's a lot of industries that are female dominated too. So she had a stereotype in her head that was not actually correct. And I mentor a very amazing young woman in a government department who was in a security operations centre, and she was, I have to program, I have to learn this deep technical side of it. And I pointed out to her that there are a number of other careers, and she works in the pen testing team now and just got a promotion. So for her, she's realised that she doesn't actually have to program. Now we need more people to program, but doing pen testing is actually a technical thing as well, and the analytics side of it in the security operations centre. So there's so many different careers, and I don't think they realise it. They think it's just the sitting there, heads down. I wasn't good at coding at school; it was all a bit scary, so I can't be in cyber.
Yeah, I know that's absolutely a massive stigma in the space that people just assume. So that's why we like to interview people like yourself to break down all of those barriers and understand that there are multiple roles depending on what skill set you do have. I'd like to understand a little bit more. I mean, you've touched on this a little bit, but I'm keen to hear from your perspective that you've mentioned that more research in our industry does need to be conducted, specifically around the degree of malicious intent. So talk to me a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so what we want to be able to do is to work out how much attention we should be spending on the attacks that are coming through, or the compromises that we're seeing. So we need to be able to give you an idea. You can tell if it's a complex attack, it's usually a nation state. So expert cryptographics, maybe homomorphic encryption, detailed knowledge of how they could concierge through countries that don't contain data logs, expert programming, mastering of telecommunications, that sort of thing. So then you start to know it's a nation state, but then you have to know the geopolitical context. So, which country do we think this is coming from? And let's say it's a country close to us that we haven't been having good political discourse with lately, then we need to start going, okay, well, what type of attack was that? And there's actually degrees of attack. So there's access, disruption, and forced or armed. So when we look at access, we're looking at they're just going in and perhaps doing some port scanning, network mapping. They've got access to your systems, and that's not particularly malicious. Then there's sort of the disruption. So they're looking to degrade or disable systems. Perhaps it's non-critical infrastructure, usually the ransomware type of thing where you give them some money and they'll go away. They're doing it from that perspective. They will give you your data back. And then there's the forced arm type of attack. So, what are they trying to do? Is it death and destruction? Is it damage to the point of critical infrastructure or systems? And why we want to know, where that is it might start with access, with the intent is to get to the forced or the armed. And when you think about that stat that an infiltrator could be in your systems for up to 200 days before you actually know it or see it. We want to know the degree of maliciousness and the origins of where it potentially comes from in more detail. Do we think that this is an access that's going to move through to an armed or a forced attack, or is it perhaps just an access? So I think it's an area that's completely unstudied, really, in terms of actual. There's only one university I know of that's actually looking at, let's have a look at what botnets are in there, what type of things are in there, what type of degree of maliciousness do we expect, because we know that they're potentially going to hit a system here based on this evidence or this data. And it all comes down to, should we be offensive? Should we be protecting, or should we be turning around and pushing back and being offensive?
So, do you anticipate that more research will be done outside of this one university that you named, or you're unsure at this stage?
Look, I think there will be more being done. I give talks at various conferences, and I like it because there's usually two or three people who are in that more forensic investigative space that come up to me and go, "Yes, yes, I love what you're saying. We have to do more." And then they say, "Okay, well, can we get some funding?" And it's like, well, I work with one company. We can only fund so much, right? We can't fund the entire scope of all the things that need to be done. So we do need to get more companies to invest, not just in their own to their own benefit in the skill shortage, how they can benefit from this, but we need them to go and give back and to fund and to help set up those programs at university, and also to help fund some of these research. Is it through PhDs? Is it through residencies? Whatever it is, we need more of it, because it's just not out there. There's funding for a whole lot of other things, but there's not the funding at the moment in a huge degree. There will be pockets, and there'll be areas, and it has increased in the last few years. But I have to say, 5 years ago, I stood up and I think there was only about 20 credible sources. Now you go onto Google Scholar and you'll see a whole heap coming through. But then when you sift through them, you realize there's really not that many still.
So would you say with your network that conversations are being had within the industry to say, hey, like, let's get a couple of companies together, let's fund this in terms of research? Is that happening or not quite yet?
No, I think the focus at the moment is on the cyber skills shortage and the engineering, and getting people to be able to operate the security operations centres, to be able to, have that deeply technical engineering capability. And I know, Department of Defence have got some fantastic programs. There's, Defence College has a whole bunch of things, and it's growing. But the focus, and it needs to be as well, right? We can't all be analysts and all look at the motivations of the behavior and then not actually know how to shut it down once they're in our system. So, and a lot of the times the forensic investigation is done after the fact. We need to be, everything's moving to online now, automated, current environment, real time. So it's all very well having an attack and going off and investigate it and coming back with a report. And yes, perhaps that can feed the next attack in terms of helping on how to respond to it. But we need it in real time. And the only way we're going to get it in real time is if these engineers actually have this information themselves as well, or we have specialists in the security operations centres that are analysing this. And obviously in things like information warfare division and Australian cybersecurity specialists in this space, but there's a skill shortage and they can't get enough people.
Yes, of course, and I'm acutely aware that we definitely need to prioritize things. It's all well and good to have these wants and needs and aspirations, but of course, yes, we've got to start and prioritize these things. So, Kylie, I really appreciate your time today. Is there any sort of closing remarks or any final thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I think a key thing is not to forget the small to medium businesses, right? So I've spoken today about the nation states, I've spoken about the organised criminal gangs, and they tend to go for the big stuff. But like I'd mentioned with the colonial pipeline, and we see it with the Hi Mum cyber threat, that's just, my mum actually got pinged by that a few weeks ago. And I was talking to a local small to medium business, is a mortgage provider, who asked for my husband's credit card over the email. My husband just happily sent it to him. And I'm just now compiling, because he says, I don't understand why that's wrong. So I'm just compiling a whole bunch of dot points to him and getting them off to him on why he shouldn't be asking for that. So I think we also need, once we've done the big stuff, we can't forget the small to medium enterprises and the mums and dads and the aunties and uncles and, all the other people around, and help with, looking at, there are motivations, and they're not as sophisticated, but there are people out there who you can buy this stuff on the dark web. They can just download hacking packages and can quickly walk away with, a few tens of thousands of dollars. So we have to be vigilant across every sector of society and every cohort. And, it's just something we have to be aware of in our homes, in our families, in our workplaces, where we play sport, in our lives.
I think that's wonderful, and I really appreciate you coming on the show today, because I know that you're busy, you got a lot of stuff going on, and you're always out there doing presentations. So I am very appreciative of your time and for you sharing your thoughts, your insights, and your experiences with us today.
No, thank you, Carissa. I really enjoyed being here, and it's great to share these thoughts. And if we can at least get, one extra person out there going, hey, I want to go and study this space, then we've done a good job.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes.
This podcast is brought to you by MERCSEC, the specialists in security, search, and recruitment solutions. Visit mercsec.com to connect today.
If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.